Hello, and welcome to your lecture on Reconstruction. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. The Civil War had ripped the country apart. Now that it was over, it was time to rebuild and reconcile. Reconstruction means rebuilding. The Reconstruction era was the period of time between 1865 and 1877 when the federal government intervened in the South to help them rebuild and recover from the Civil War. And there was a lot to recover from. Cities had been destroyed, homes burned, fields trampled, all sorts of property destroyed. Even worse than the physical damage was the fact that the South had lost its slaves. The South had invested in slaves more than in anything else, more than in factories or railroads or land. They put all of their eggs into one oppressive basket. And so when that basket was taken away and the slaves were set free, the South was left without their source of free labor, and they had lost a lot of money. They hadn't just lost a lot of money. They had also lost a lot of men. The population in the South was much smaller than that in the North, and so 75% of Confederate males had ended up fighting in the Civil War. 1 out of 5 men between the ages of 18 and 24 died during the Civil War. That meant everyone knew someone who had fought in the war, and everyone knew at least one person who had died. What about the slaves? 4 million people had just been freed. These former slaves were eager to start their new lives, but they had nothing or almost nothing. Where were they going to go? What were they going to do? How are they going to get food to eat? How are they going to get the education that would let them get ahead in life? Into all of this stepped the United States. But things were not quite peaceful yet. Even though the war was over, the South was furious at the North still. They felt like they had lost everything. And the North was furious too. Lots of people from the North had died during the Civil War as well, and the country had gone deeply into debt in order to sustain the war effort. People were upset with the South. They wanted to punish the South. When you have a situation like this, when you have two sides that are angry with each other and ready to go at each other's throats, you need a calm, compassionate leader to reconcile the two sides and find a just solution. Abraham Lincoln might have been that man. After all, he saw the United States as one big family. He wanted a peaceful reconciliation. In his second inaugural address, that's a speech he gave when he became president for the second time, he said, "With malice toward none, and charity towards all, let us bind up the nation's wounds." In other words, the Civil War has hurt all of us. When it's over, let's make sure that without holding resentment or bad feelings toward anybody, but instead holding a feeling of kindness toward everybody, let us heal those wounds in a way that will allow us to move on, united together as a country. Under Abraham Lincoln, Reconstruction might have turned out very differently, but we'll never know, because less than a week after the Civil War ended, he was assassinated by a Southern actor named John Wilkes Booth. Now, John Wilkes Booth actually thought that he was doing the South a favor. He thought the whole South would laud him for killing the President of the United States that had led the Union to victory. What he didn't understand was that while the South had been angry when Abraham Lincoln became president, now that the war was over, they realized that this just and thoughtful man was their best chance at a peaceful and fair reconciliation. Now that Abraham Lincoln was dead, all the people left in power were really angry at the South, and in turn, the South was really angry at John Wilkes Booth. The North, of course, was angry too. The whole nation grieved the passing of Abraham Lincoln, and we should grieve his passing too, both because he was a great man and because without his leadership, what followed was not pretty. 8 months After the ending of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed, outlawing slavery. Hooray! That was a great step towards ending a major injustice. Unfortunately, ending injustice takes more than laws, although laws are important. You have to change hearts and minds as well. And here's how that played out in the South. You see, the South, like I said, they were angry at the North. They had not changed their minds about slavery. They still thought that black people were inferior. And so now that slavery was illegal, they decided that they were going to try and find a way to keep slavery in everything but name. So they started passing laws called the Black Codes that tried to force free black men and women into a position like slavery. And when the North learned about that, they became enraged and they said, that is not okay. That is not what we intended to happen. We are going to take action. And they did. They split up the South into 5 military districts. They sent Northern troops down to the South and they said, keep order and make sure those black people are being treated equally. They set up the Freedmen's Bureau to help feed, clothe, house, and provide medical care to freed slaves. They also set up schools so that former slaves could get an education in order to help them get ahead in life. Those early years of Reconstruction were a golden age. Remember back to our Causes of the Civil War lecture when white slave owners were trying to defend slavery by saying, but black people need white masters to take care of them. They can't take care of themselves. Well, black people were proving very candidly that they absolutely could take care of themselves and take care of other people too. They began voting and running for office and getting elected to office at the local level, at the state level, and even at the national level. And once elected, they proved themselves to be great leaders because they began working with white politicians to pass laws that helped everybody. That this is when you start seeing public schools coming into the South, better roads. They start passing laws to try to get railroads into the South to help them industrialize. All seemed to be going well. But all was not well. The Civil War was still very fresh in everybody's minds, and there were still many Southerners who were angry with the North. And when you're angry with someone, when you really dislike them, it becomes very easy to pin all of your troubles on them. And that is exactly what these Southerners did. Things were better before the Civil War, they would say. It was better when blacks were slaves and when the North minded its own business. They were still racist. They still believed that black people were inferior, and they resented the fact that these inferior people would dare to vote and run for office and make laws that affected them. Hang on a minute, I hear you say. How could they still be racist? Couldn't they tell by this point that black people were able to get an education just like they were? That they were able to think and vote and make laws just like white people? How could they still be racist? That's a good question, and there are several factors involved. One of them is, of course, the fact that when you grow up with a belief and a way of acting, it's really hard to change that way of thinking. But there's another deeper reason as well. Remember again, the Civil War is fresh in everyone's minds. Everybody has known somebody who fought in the Civil War. Everybody knows someone who was killed in the Civil War. Many of those people who were killed would have been their sons, their fathers, or their friends, or their brothers. When you are grieving somebody who died in war, it can help you cope to think of that person as having fought valiantly for the right. However, remember, these people had been fighting for the Confederacy. They had been fighting for the right to keep slaves. And the main justification for keeping those slaves was that black people just weren't as good as white people, so it was okay to keep them in slavery. Well, if the abolitionists were right after all, and black people are not inferior to white people, if they are in fact white people's equal in every way, then slavery is wrong. And if slavery is wrong, then their husbands and brothers and friends and sons and fathers died not for a good cause, but for a bad cause. They died defending evil. Nobody wants to think that about a loved one. The truth can be very hard to bear, and it was too hard to bear for many of the Southerners, and they chose, instead of embracing that truth, to be blind so that they could continue to think the best of their loved ones who had died in battle. That is not an excuse. Their blindness would go on to cause great suffering to many people over the following years, but it does provide at least a partial explanation for why, even in face of evidence to the contrary, people continued to cling to racist beliefs. These angry Southerners began to vote for politicians called redeemers. Redeemers promised to restore the South to its old glory, that is, to where it had been before the beginning of the Civil War. Redeemers immediately began passing laws that made it very difficult, nearly impossible, for many Black people to vote. Why? Well, of course, if Black people can't vote, they don't get a say in who gets elected. They don't get a say in what laws are passed. And oh, what laws were passed. Segregation is the separating of people by race. And the segregation laws the Redeemers passed made it so that Black and white people had to use different hospitals, go to different schools, sit on different parts of the bus, even drink from different water fountains. The segregation laws affected every part of life. And as if that weren't enough, violence begins erupting in towns across the South. Lynching is when a group of people kill someone without a fair trial. They accuse a person of having done something, and perhaps the person did it, perhaps they didn't. You'll never know, because they don't get a trial. The group just kills them. Between the years 1882 and 1968, more than 4,743 people were lynched in the United States, the vast majority of them in the South. Some white people were lynched, mostly for supporting Black people or Black people's rights, but of course, the vast majority of people who were lynched were Black. They lynched people for trying to vote. They lynched people for trying to stand up to a white person who was treating them unfairly. They even sometimes lynched people for owning something that a white person wanted. You know, after they're dead, you can take their stuff. At first, the lynchings were disorganized. They weren't necessarily connected. However, pretty soon you have an organization forming called the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK. You may have heard of it. They're still around today. And the KKK used violence to terrify Black people into not voting and not standing up for their rights. Between repressive laws and terrifying violence, life for Black people in and after Reconstruction became so bad that some people argued it was even worse than slavery. If you look in the picture section, there is a political cartoon that demonstrates very vividly that point of view. Things would get better, but not for a long time. Reconstruction, the story of Reconstruction, is a sad one. Reconstruction was, in the end, a failure. The North didn't intervene to stop the violence. They withdrew troops in 1877 and left the South to its own devices. Still, though, there are some lessons that can be drawn from it. The first one is if you look back to that golden era of Reconstruction, you can see that it is possible, even after a long period of oppression, even after a civil war in which many people are hurt and killed, it is possible for people to set aside their differences and work together for the common good. That early era of Reconstruction should be an inspiring story to us all that people can overcome hurt and prejudice to work together. The second lesson is a more sobering one. Laws are important in preventing injustice, and the United States did pass laws in order to prevent injustice to Black people. We have the 13th Amendment that outlaws slavery. We have the 14th and 15th Amendment that protected former slaves and all of our rights. But laws aren't always enough. When people's hearts and minds remain unchanged, there will always be people who are trying to take away those rights, who are trying to perpetrate injustice. And it is the duty of every single one of us to stand up both for our rights and for the rights of other people. Only by standing up for our rights and the rights of other people can we make sure that all people in our great nation remain equally and fairly treated. Thank you.